All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC's webinar, The Cultural Accommodation Model for Substance Abuse Treatment, or CAMSAT, for Latino Adolescents. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Jason Burrows Sanchez, Professor of Counseling Psychology and Principal Investigator for the Central Rockies ATTC at the University of Utah. I will tell you more about him a little later. During today's webinar, all participants will be muted. The audio will be streamed through the computer, so please make sure your computer speakers are turned on and up to hear today's presentation. I'm going to give you more housekeeping items. If you notice that your viewer does not fit your screen, you can expand it by clicking the expand button located in the top right corner indicated by the red arrow. Now you'll see that your viewer is expanded to fit the entire screen. Also, you can collapse the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen by clicking on the small red arrow on the left of the toolbar. And then you can click the arrow again and it will expand. As I mentioned, for today's webinar, all participants will be muted. As we move through the presentation, if you have a question for a presenter, you can use the chat box on the toolbar. Simply type your question and hit send. So what we'll be doing is that we're going to leave the questions for the end of the presentation. I will be receiving them, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Also, a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic Latino. Approximately 1 week from today, you can also find recordings and slides from all of our past webinars at the same URL. One NADAC, one NBCC, and one ICNRC continuing education credit is available to those who attend today's live event. So if you're interested in obtaining CEUs from these organizations, you may email us at hispaniclatino@uccaribe.edu. As I mentioned, today's webinar is sponsored by the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC. As of October 1st of 2012, the network has been restructured and now consists of 10 regional ATTCs, 4 national focus area ATTCs, along with the network coordinating office. As you can see by this map, the ATTC network regions were realigned to better fit the current HHS regions. So you can see that we have the national focus area centers on the left. Today's webinar is the 19th in a series that the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC is offering, and the 4th in a specific series of EVPs. The ATTC network is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, and serves a critical role in improving the health of the United States. The network achieves this by translating, disseminating, and promoting the adoption and implementation of evidence-based clinical practices, and strives to improve the health and wellness of individuals whose lives have been impacted by substance use disorders. As I mentioned, the ATTC network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance use and mental illness on America's communities through its programs and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential to health, that prevention works, that treatment is effective, and people recover from mental health and substance use disorders. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our presenter. Dr. Jason Burrows Sanchez is a professor of counseling psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. He's also the principal investigator of the Central Rockies Region 8 Addiction Technology Transfer Center, ATTC, funded by SAMHSA, as I mentioned, at the Utah Addiction Center, University of Utah. His research interests include the prevention and treatment of substance abuse problems for adolescents in school and community settings, with a particular interest in Latino adolescents. His research has been funded at the local, state, and national levels and has published numerous articles, chapters, and books. He's also a licensed psychologist in the state of Utah. So now, before we begin the presentation, we're going to have a poll questioning that includes a pretest. Okay, so we're going to begin that. Okay. Do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders? And we have 80% yes, 19% no. Okay. Next question. Are you planning to serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders in the next 6 months? And we have 70% say yes, 26 don't know, and 5% no. What is your current professional role? We have 28% social worker, case manager, 40% counselor therapist, 10% faculty research student, 7% government official or policymaker, and 21% other. Next question. What type of setting do you currently work in? And we have 7% academic, 53% treatment, 11% research, 12% government. So now we're going to do our pretest. Evidence-based treatments for substance abuse were initially developed and tested for youth from all racial ethnic groups. Yes or no? And we have 86% false and 14% true. Next question. Latino adolescents only benefit from substance abuse treatments that have been culturally adapted. And we have 61% say false and 35% say true. Now our last question. The CAMSAT is a model for culturally accommodating substance abuse treatment. 100% say true. Okay, thank you everybody for answering that. Okay. So as I mentioned, you can ask questions via our chat box, and we'll be doing the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to leave you with Dr. Jason Burrows Sanchez.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you.
Perfect.
Okay.
Hang on one sec. Okay, great. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day to sit through this presentation. My goal is to make it informative and useful. Please ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the presentation. A couple notes. I have a limited time. I only have about 45 minutes or so to get through this, so I will go through some of the slides faster than others, but I'll also give you some references and some resources, things you can check out on your own as well. My name is Dr. Jason Bro Sanchez. I'm a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Utah. I've been here since 2002. I'm originally from Southern California, a city called Ventura, which is a little bit north of Los Angeles, for those of you who know that area. My research area from grad school until now has been adolescent substance abuse, both prevention and intervention or treatment, and with a particular interest in Latino adolescents, and also both in school and community settings. So today what I'm going to show you or talk to you about is one of the models that we developed here at the University of Utah. So just a quick webinar overview. There's 4 questions, and these questions are really developed on the fact sheet that you have gotten earlier. And if you take a look at the fact sheet, those are basically those different boxes on the fact sheet have 4 main questions. And so the first one is, why are Latino adolescents in need of efficacious substance abuse treatments? The second one is, do Latino adolescents benefit from culturally adapted treatment? Third one is, what is the CAMSAT, which was one of the pretest questions? And also, how has the CAMSAT been used in the context of clinical trials for Latino adolescents? Well, just to be really clear, I am not going to focus as much today on questions 1 and 2. And the rationale for that is I did a previous webinar in February, which I will give you some information about in a few slides, that you can go back and look at. And really, it was a 90-minute webinar that covers a lot of the background information in terms of previous studies, meta-analysis, Latino adolescents and treatment and so forth. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that today. What I am going to spend more time on are questions 3 and 4. Okay. So that said, before moving along, I do want to have some acknowledgments, and I always do this in my presentations because usually when you see folks presenting on different information, whether it be in person or webinar, you usually hear one person or see one person presenting. What I really want to acknowledge is that it's not just one person, it's a group of people that make research happen. And I really want to acknowledge everybody that I work with and help me do the work that I do. In particular, the National Hispanic Latino ATTC, I want to thank them for inviting me to present this information. Everybody there has been great. Also, all my staff and crew here at the Central Rockies ATTC at the University of Utah, I really appreciate all the work that everyone does, and I couldn't do it without you. And then folks at the University of Utah, the Addiction Center, and also my department, my home department, the Department of Educational Psychology. The other folks, because I'll be telling you about some studies, there's all the community partners we've worked with. And I'll tell you more about that as we go along. But that includes the different places that we've conducted research at, the participants, that includes the adolescents, the parents, providers, et cetera. And then last but certainly not least, you all, the webinar participants. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today for me to have the opportunity to share some of this information with you. Okay, so we're going to move on. And I talked about originally 2 slides back that the first 2 questions I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. However, these next 2 slides are going to cover the first 2 questions, but they'll be relatively brief. So the first question is really around why are Latino adolescents in need of efficacious treatment? Well, probably with this audience, I don't probably have to make a big rationale for why that is, but here are some highlights in terms of, you know, depending on what census data you read, this is pretty current, but 54 million Latinos in the U.S., about a third of which are under the age of 18, or youth or adolescents. That's primarily the population I work with. So not a small group by any means. What we also find in this next bullet point actually references Latino adolescents is that we find higher rates of substance use disorders within Latino adolescents as compared to their white or African American counterparts, and you can see the percentages there. The other piece is that standard versions of evidence-based practices, whatever those may be, cognitive behavioral interventions, you know, individual group-based interventions, whatever those things are, family interventions, were not initially developed or designed for Latinos, and have not really extensively been examined for Latino adolescents. Again, a lot of this stuff I cover in the last webinar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over that, but I just wanted to make that point. The second major question was do Latino adolescents benefit from culturally adapted treatment? And sometimes this question becomes a little bit tricky because it really depends on how you think about it. So I'm going to present 2 points here. One, and I think they're really important to understand the distinction between them. One is when you compare a culturally adapted treatment to treatment as usual or a standard or non-adapted treatment, but for example, it's another treatment. So a lot of meta-analysis that you will look at studies that have compared a culturally accommodated treatment to another treatment. And that treatment may be anywhere from treatment as usual, which is not much, to another treatment that has not been adapted. In general, when you look at those interventions, you tend to find that folks benefit from the culturally adapted treatment. But the results are mixed. And what I mean by that is when you actually look at the number of studies, there's not a lot of specific studies on Latino adolescents in substance abuse treatment. Those meta-analyses really take from studies across the spectrum in terms of adults through adolescence and generally across various types of disorders, substance abuse disorders being one of them. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out. The second point is when you compare when you compare a culturally adapted version of a treatment to the standard version of the same treatment, okay? So this is a culturally adapted version of, let's say, group-based intervention to the standard version of the same group-based intervention. Now, in general, this is what most of us want to know about. Do the evidence-based practices that are out there now that are standard, how do they compare to their culturally adapted counterparts? Now, unfortunately, when you look at Latino adolescents and substance abuse, there's only about 4 studies out there, believe it or not. And half of those studies I'm going to talk about today because we've done them here at the University of Utah. And what we found so far is that the benefits tend to be moderated by specific cultural variables, which I'll explain more. However, again, going back to these 2 points, which I really think are important to understand, it really depends on what you're comparing it to, okay? But actually, the question about when a standard version of a generic treatment is compared to its culturally adapted counterpart, there are very few studies out there, okay? But that's what we'll be talking about today. The last point is just the information around the prior webinar. I did that in February. If you go to the Central Rockies ATTC webpage, which you can Google, click on our special topics and then scroll down. When you get to that page, scroll down for the webinar that starts with the words culturally adapted, and that'll be the one you can go to. And it's a direct link, so you'll be able to access that. Okay, the third question is what is the CAMSAT? And that is the Cultural Accommodation Model for Substance Abuse Treatment. And it really is the model that we developed when we thought about how to do studies when we wanted to test a culturally adapted intervention versus its generic counterpart, okay? So a lot of my mentors and so forth, when I started doing this work, were like, well, you know, good luck with that, because there's a lot of different models out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the models out there that you see are mostly theoretical. They have, or they can be based on kind of case studies, but or anecdotal evidence, but they really haven't been empirically tested. And so when you look at the different models out there, one of the things you have to decide is which one am I going to use? Well, like good scientists, we kind of developed our own, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But the model is really around how do you develop a culturally adapted version of an evidence-based practice and then test the 2 components, or test the 2 versions against each other. The model is really composed of 4 different stages: source of information, accommodation practices, initial testing to comparative testing, which I'm going to go more into now. So here's what the model looks like visually. I'm sorry, the model actually is a little bit small. It's taken out of one of the papers we did. But what I want to point out, and hopefully you can see the red cursor that I have here, but what I want to point out is these various components of the model. The first one is the first stage, which is source of information. So anytime you're trying to develop an intervention, typically, like good scientists and good students, we go to the literature base, right? Your professor or whoever tells you, go to the literature base, see what's been done before. Okay, we can do that. The other thing we typically do when we're trying to develop interventions is ask other experts, right? Informed expert opinion. And there's no lack of experts out there who want to give you their opinion. The other thing we typically do is research. We go to our research team and we say, well, what are things have we seen anecdotally with the clients or participants we've worked with. What do those look like? What are things we can integrate into our interventions? Okay, that's all great, and many of the interventions that have been developed cover these three bases. One of the ones they don't cover, which is one of the ones we added, was actually going to the potential participants who's going to benefit or use the intervention. And we call this community stakeholders. One of the things that's recommended a lot in the literature, and you can look at a lot of cultural accommodation or adaptation models, is actually working with the community before you start the intervention. Unfortunately, it's frequently not done in practice. So there's a lot of recommendations to do it, but when you actually look at the number of folks who do, it's really small. Probably the reasons for that, it takes a lot of legwork, and that's one of the hypotheses I make in one of our papers. However, it's really important, and it's really important in which to really make sure you're getting your most sources of information you can in order to inform your intervention. Okay, I'll go into more of that in a bit. The other next piece is the stages. Or I'm sorry, stage 2, which is the accommodation practices, which really talks about what do you do with the information that you've obtained from stage 1. Well, we kind of visualize it as, conceptualize it as, well, we have two things. We have the treatment content, right, the intervention we're actually going to deliver, and then the treatment delivery, how we deliver that intervention, okay? And hold that for a bit because I'm going to go back and talk about that as well. The third and fourth stages really go into testing the intervention because at some point you got to test it. Stage 3 is the pilot testing piece, so it's kind of a feasibility study. Are people going to, can you get people to come to intervention? Will they stay? Will they see it as important? Will they like it? So on and so forth. And then the fourth stage is more of the randomized trial, and the idea is that, you know, how can you find efficacy for your intervention? Does it seem to work? And if it does work, who does it seem to work for, and so forth. So basically, in a nutshell, these are the things that I'm going to cover, hopefully, in the next 25, 30 minutes or so. Okay, so what I am actually going to talk about next is the CAMSAT model in the context of clinical trials. So what I'm going to attempt to do is talk about 5 years of research in the context of about 25 minutes. So the study that we did, and it's actually a series of studies here at the University of Utah, is called VITA study, or the Validating Interventions for Diverse Adolescents. The overview of the VITA study really is, when you break it down, it's really composed of 3 different studies. The first study is the focus group study, which I'll talk about in a sec. The goal of this study basically was development of the culturally accommodated treatment, which you probably got from the model I just showed you. The second study was the pilot study, which we randomized 35 Latino adolescents, and really was about feasibility, showing that we could get folks to come to our intervention, they would engage in our intervention, so on and so forth. And the third study is the randomized clinical trial, which was 70 Latino adolescents that we randomized into 2 groups. The majority of these adolescents were recruited out of juvenile justice here in the Salt Lake City area. And it was also a group-based intervention, and I'll tell you about that more in a sec. Okay, so the first study that I want to focus on, and remember back to that sources of information piece and that community stakeholders piece in the model. So really our first study was about trying to engage community stakeholders, the potential community stakeholders, the potential participants of the intervention. And we did this in the first year of our study. It honestly took us about 6 months just to do the legwork, to make the connections, to make the contacts in which to do the focus groups. Our focus groups consisted of the local Latino community, which consisted of Latino parents, Latino adolescents, and Latino community leaders. And we have a paper on this, which is referenced at the bottom, which talks about the various ways that we were able to do that, because I'm not going to have time to go in depth of how we kind of did each of that. However, I do want to show you the various groups that we worked with. Another group we worked with, because we knew we were going to recruit largely out of juvenile justice, was the probation officers. Because I consider consumers of the intervention both direct and indirect. So let's say your adolescents, because it's an adolescent-based intervention, may be more direct consumers, right? And parents may be more direct consumers. But your indirect consumers, which you also should consider, I believe, is the leaders, Latino community leaders, probation officers, the people who are going to refer, and the other group we included was substance abuse providers in the community. We wanted to know what other therapists thought about this type of intervention, what was already out there, what they were doing, so on and so forth. Okay, so both direct and indirect consumers. What we asked about in the focus groups were things about what is the current consensus on Latino adolescents? What do folks think? You know, pros and cons, what are some of the things that are challenges, what are not challenges, etc. Also, substance abuse treatment for Latino adolescents, what does that look like in the community? Also, Latino families, acculturation, and ethnic identity, although clearly when we work with people outside of the research realm, we don't call them things like acculturation and ethnic identity. So just to point that out. The other thing that so what came out of, actually let me back up a sec. So our major perspectives were the things here. The three major variables that we actually looked at, and what just came up was the cultural variables piece, was Latino families, which we call familiaism, acculturation, and ethnic identity. And part of that came out of, if you think back to the first stage of the model, was our literature search and informed expert opinions. What are some of the things we want to look at within the intervention? So the major themes which I'm going to focus on more, so this is kind of the information that came out of our focus groups, were things like family, acculturation, ethnic identity, substance abuse treatment, and barriers to treatment. Okay, well, I'm going to try to make that more clear on this next slide. Because the question I always get, well, that's great, Jason, but what did you do with that information, and how did it translate into the intervention? Well, here's one example of how we did that. Now, in the paper I referenced, again, we have a whole table that's larger than this. I'm only giving you a few examples that kind of demonstrate how those things translate. So if you look at the major theme, for example, up at the top, ethnic identity, which I told you was one of the themes that came out. Some of the sub-themes, so some of the things that people talked about, whether they were in the adolescent group or the parent group, they talked about identity of the self, right? How do Latino adolescents identify with the self? I actually conducted the focus group with the Latino adolescents. When I asked them this question, about half of them identified with things that were positive, they saw as positive, half of them identified with things that were negative. What I really found was that they had a hard time coming up with a consistent kind of identification of themselves. What we found from the parents and others is they felt like Latino adolescents had a lack or loss of identity of self, feeling like they were in between two cultural worlds, not that different from things that we hear about anecdotally or in the research literature. But by and large, everyone, especially the adults, had the idea that ethnic identity was really important, and we need to figure out how to bolster that in Latino adolescents. So what we did is our accommodation practices, which is the second stage of the model, is we informed that in terms of our treatment content. So what we did with that is we developed a new module, which I'll show you in the overview of the intervention in a sec, but it was called Ethnic Identity and Adjustment Module. We also integrated throughout the intervention, throughout the culturally adapted intervention, therapists would discuss things like racism and discrimination, things that came up that were relevant for Latino adolescents, okay, to make the examples more relevant, more salient for the population we're working with. The next one is family. What we found overall in terms of the sub-themes is parents wanted to be involved. And we did a group-based intervention, so the majority of the interventions obviously is focused on adolescents, is outpatient group-based. However, we found that the parents wanted to be involved. What we also found was that parents many times in the community felt like they couldn't be involved because of language barriers or that places were just not that welcoming in terms of the treatment they provide. So what we did here is we translated that both in treatment content and delivery. And if you look at the examples, C means content, D means delivery. So content, an example would be we infused role plays with relevant family situations throughout the adapted intervention. In terms of delivery, we increased contact with parents, and I'll show you that in a sec. Barriers to services was another one that came up. And again, this is not a big news flash. We know this from the literature and our own anecdotal work with clients. Cost was always a barrier. Work and family obligations, right? People not having time off or reliable transportation. Language difficulties. What we found through our focus groups was that adolescents, by and large, in our studies, prefer to speak English. Parents, by and large, prefer to speak Spanish. So we needed to have folks on our staff who were bilingual and could communicate in both languages. And honestly, what we found a lot of the parents and the adolescents felt services in the community were just not welcoming. Okay, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. And then treatment delivery, how we translated that was we had bilingual staff interacting with parents and adolescents, Scheduling was based on the needs of the family, evenings and weekends. Anyone working with me knows that we work evenings and weekends. It's not 8 to 5 because that's normally not when families are able to meet. We provided bus tokens, and the location of intervention was actually at a community center. It wasn't on campus. That's one of the questions I get a lot. And my question is, well, how many times have your participants that you're trying to work with set foot on a college campus, right? And in our case, that is not very high in terms of the population that we work with here in Salt Lake. So why would I put it on a university campus as opposed to in a location that makes more sense that's actually in their community? Okay, so some practical issues, some things that I always get asked about are language, and I've already hinted at one of those. Adolescents and parents, by and large, adolescents preferred to speak English. Our groups were mostly run in English, although all of our staff was bilingual. And parents primarily preferred Spanish. So our therapists were able to engage with the adolescents and parents in the preferred language. All of our materials, of course, were translated in both languages as well. Recruitment is also another important issue, a practical issue, because what I talk about this is the social validity of your intervention, of your treatment, right? And what I mean by this is how attractive is your intervention to whatever group you're trying to work with. In this case, with us, it's Latino adolescents. So one attractive feature was they didn't have to go to the university to engage in this, right? They could do it in their community. We worked at a community center where kids could ride their bikes or take the bus. It was on a bus line. We would map out bus lines for the kids we worked with. Also, the community center had other things that were going on. For example, they had free tax preparation for anyone who made under $50,000. They had a gym there. They had a computer lab. So actually what we would find is that parents would drop their kids off and stay during the hour and a half until their kids were done because they could engage in other activities. So what I really encourage people to do is think about the social validity or the attractiveness of the intervention to your participants, right, or your treatment. I always try to put myself in the shoes of the consumer, whether direct or indirect, and say, why would I want to engage in this intervention? And if you can't come up with a lot of reasons why, you should probably really think about that, because it really leads to the next point in terms of engagement and retention. Because if people don't see your intervention as being attractive or something that's going to be beneficial to them, the reasons for continuing their involvement are going to be low. Okay, and this is one of the problems that we have with dropout in terms of intervention in general. If you look at outpatient substance abuse treatment in general, the CAMSAT data and so forth, we know that adolescents, more than half drop out of treatment before it's done, okay, which is a real problem. And I think some of those issues go back to things like the social validity or the attractiveness of the intervention. Okay, the next slide is just something I wanted to point out around social validity. This is actually, it looks like a flat slide, but it's actually, it was a trifold that we provided all participants. And this is part of a research study, so I don't know the last time you've read a consent form, but those are really long, laborious, dense, 5 to 6 page documents. Well, this is basically an overview of our study that we gave to parents and adolescents. This is something they could open up, we could write on, they could post on their fridge or on the wall or whatever, so they would know what was going on at the various time points of the study and what was going to happen. Also, so that when we contacted them again, they wouldn't forget who we were and so forth. But just one of the ideas, one of the things to make it more attractive, to increase the social validity of the intervention. Okay, so studies 2 and 3, and I know I'm rushing through some of this, and I apologize for that, but it's just due to time. Studies 2 and 3 were really kind of replication studies. So studies 2, which I talked about before, was the pilot study, the feasibility study. That was 35 adolescents randomized into 2 groups. We have that published in a paper, and I referenced that. That's actually up here, our 2012 paper. What we did for study 3 was we replicated that with double the sample size, which was 70 adolescents, which is the study that I'm going to talk more about today. So, and that is referenced in our 2015 paper. But basically, in a nutshell, the treatments were 2 treatments. They had a standard cognitive behavioral treatment, which came out of the Cognitive Behavioral Coping Skills Therapy Manual, which comes out of Project Match from the late 80s, early 90s, which has been translated for adolescents, both individual and group-based. What we did is we culturally accommodated that intervention into what we call the Accommodated Culturally Behavioral Treatment Intervention, or ACBT. And we did that through the process that I just showed you a few slides back, which I tried to explain in a short amount of time. But anyway, that's how we did it. So the idea was the integration of cultural elements into treatment, content, and delivery. So we modified both the treatment, content, and delivery. However, the goal was to keep the underlying cognitive behavioral elements the same across both treatments. So it's really more about increasing the social validity of the treatment rather than changing any of the dynamics of the cognitive behavioral learning skills, the things that you typically find in cognitive behavioral interventions and so forth. We didn't really want to change any of the evidence-based elements of it, if that makes sense. Because if we did, we would actually be changing the intervention, and you really wouldn't be testing two interventions against each other that are very similar in nature. And that's what we wanted. We really wanted the only differences to be the cultural elements. Delivery was in a small group. I do group-based interventions. Why? Because actually, if you look at the adolescent substance use literature, there's not many group-based interventions out there compared to either family or individual-based interventions, which is really surprising, given that if you look at the literature, group-based is done as more than, or it does the same or more than individual-based interventions. There were 1.5 hour, 90-minute sessions over 12 weeks. We did it at a community center, and actually I trained my bilingual doctoral student therapists to deliver the interventions. Here's an overview of the treatment content. Okay, so it's 12 sessions. On one side here, you see the standard, which is basically the standard intervention. This is what kids would get at typically any treatment center, regardless if they're Latino or not. The accommodated piece is the accommodated intervention, which was the intervention that basically we increased the social validity or interjected the cultural elements with. One of the things I talked about before was the ethnic identity and adjustment module, which we did here, and we actually have one of my former students, who's now a professor, is doing a qualitative study looking at that particular session, because we videotaped all the sessions for adherence, and actually is looking at what came out of qualitatively some of the ethnic adjustment and identity information, which actually looks to be pretty neat. The other thing we did is we integrated a drug education module, which if I had to do it again, I would probably do it across both. But we did this because in the focus groups, we found that a lot of Latino adolescents felt like they weren't really getting information about what drugs did to their brain or their body. Well, we work on the assumption that you make better decisions if, and you problem solve better if you have more accurate information. I asked them what type of information they got in their school settings, and basically what they got is just say no. And I asked them if that was helpful, and they said no. And I asked them what they really wanted, and they really wanted information about what drugs do to your brain and your body. What are the consequences, right? So what you're not seeing in this accommodated piece is you're not seeing the elements, some of the elements that I've already referred to in terms of the integration of relevant and salient role plays or practice skills. And also, you know, we changed the names. So instead of John, it was Juan, or instead of George, it was Jorge. You know, just some things to increase the social validity of the intervention. We found in our standard piece, because both of these interventions, Latino adolescents, we worked with 100% Latino adolescents, mostly of Mexican descent, but they were randomized into both sides. In our standard intervention, some of our Latino adolescents will ask, well, because they were just typically Anglo names and so forth in the examples, where isn't there any Latinos in any of these examples? The treatment delivery in terms of the VITA piece is, here we have the standard again, which is right here, and here the accommodated. We provided attendance reminder calls, or ARCs, for both. What we also did is increase the interaction with the parents, because that's one of the things we really found that they wanted. Through providing, after every third session, we provided a call home, the therapist did, and also we had generic mailings of what the things the kids were working on in the particular sessions. Now, we didn't break confidentiality or anything. These were just generic ideas of what skill sets and what skills the kids were learning in the intervention. That was a way to increase and bolster the parent intervention. Okay, here is some of the demographics. As you can see, the majority of our kids were of Mexican descent based on their parents in both conditions. Also, annual family income, the majority of our families were around 70% or more were $25,000 or less, so a fairly low income sample. Sorry, I'm rushing here, but we just have a little bit of time. So here are the major outcomes for the study. for study 3. You can see the retention piece. We had about a 73% retention rate, or I'm sorry, completion rate, and 84% of our adolescents showed up for the post-treatment and 3-month follow-up assessments. The 73% treatment completion rate is 9 out of 12 sessions, which is kind of a standard in the literature. That's 75% of the sessions that they completed, which we actually felt was pretty high. We did find some variation between the types of interventions, the CBT, SCBT, which is the standard, and the ACBT. Sorry, I know that becomes a little blurry, but it's 67% with 79%. And basically what that means is we found more kids completing the ACBT, which is actually what we anticipated, because we increased the social validity of that intervention more than obviously we did the standard. Attendance in both groups was about the same. Substance use levels, I'm going to skip for a second. I'm going to jump to a slide here. And this is some of the outcomes. So what we did, or what we found, is that both groups across time, from pre to post to 3-month follow-up, and actually we have 6-month data and 12-month data, which we're going to publish next, which is not included here. We found that both groups, kids in both groups, standard or accommodated, were changing at about the same rates. Okay, not too surprising, because both interventions were active, and that's typically what you tend to find when you're comparing 2 active interventions. However, what we did is we looked at some of the cultural variables that we're interested in, and we analyzed them as moderators. And moderators can be considered various characteristics that people come to the intervention with. So one of the moderators that we looked at was ethnic identity. And there's 2 components of ethnic identity. One is commitment, and the other is exploration. Well, in the commitment piece of ethnic identity, it's about, well, how kids commit to who they are, who they think they are in terms of their ethnic self. Here's what we found. We found, and if you look at the 2 ellipses I just showed up, if you follow the lines, everyone started out roughly in the same areas. And what's here on this axis is the number of estimated mean number of days of substance use, excluding tobacco, but everything else that they used at pre-treatment. You can see that they dropped at post-treatment, so most kids were going down, and then some groups started to increase at the 3-month follow-up. Now, if you consider the kids that did the best and the worst, so these 2 groups at the bottom where the ellipse is green, those are the kids we consider, quote, to do the best. The kids at the top, quote, considered to do worse because of their level of substance abuse, and that's how we're qualifying that. What we find here for these 2 groups, so let's take just the blue line here, these are kids who were randomized into the standard condition and also came into the intervention saying that they have low commitment to their ethnic identity, all right? The next one, or the second group of kids who did the best, these are kids in the accommodated condition. Instead, they came into the intervention with higher commitment for the ethnic identity. Now, these next 2 groups are mismatched. Basically, what this means is that the yellow group is these are kids in the standard condition, and these are kids who had high commitment to their ethnic identity. So if you go back to these 2 groups, these 2 on the bottom, what it means is kids in the standard condition who had low ethnic identity, right? So the idea is they maybe looked more like Anglo kids, or ethnic identity, which actually really wasn't that salient a variable to them, did fine in the standard condition. Kids who actually did have higher ethnic identity tended to do better in the adapted condition. Okay? That's what these graphs are showing. This next graph is the exploration moderator, which is basically exploration as a subcomponent of ethnic identity, which means the opportunity that the kids had time to explore who they are as an ethnic person. We found the same trends. Okay, so when we call this culture congruent, culture incongruent, when the characteristics of the kids, and that's the moderator, was culturally congruent with the intervention they received, they tended to do better, okay, in terms of lower number of substance use days at our 3-month follow-up. So major points for ethnic identity here: substance use outcomes were better when ethnic identity and treatment were culturally congruent. Substance use outcomes were worse when they weren't. Okay, here is another cultural variable that we looked at, which is the familiaism moderator. The important distinction here is this is actually, because we measured familiaism both for parents and adolescents. When we analyzed it for adolescents, it actually didn't come out. When we analyzed it for parents, it actually did, meaning that when we looked at the level of familialism that parents had when the kids started treatment, that seemed to be related to how their kids did 3 months after. So when parents had low familialism and their kids were randomized into the standard condition, which is the blue line here, those kids tended to do the best. When parents had higher familialism and their kids were randomized into the accommodated condition, those kids tended to do the second best. And then you can see the reverse trend is true on the ellipse above that. So the major points here, so what I'm trying to point out is the trends between all these three graphs, the trends are the same. The major point is that when the cultural variable, which is the moderator, when the cultural variable and the treatment condition were culturally congruent, or the fit was there, basically the kids tended to do better in terms of less substance use across time. When the cultural variable and the treatment were not fit or not culturally congruent, they tended to do not as well. Okay, so that's really the major take-home message there. And I know I rushed through that, but I want to be able to provide some time at the end for questions and so forth. So I'm going to leave you with that. What I do have here are some references of everything I referenced here in the webinar, and also my contact information. If you want to know more information, I am happy to talk to you about it and so forth, and whatever you need. And then I also just want to say thank you for participating. I do apologize for having to rush through most of that, but I hope there are some good questions.
Thank you, Jason. That was excellent. Right now, let me see what questions we have. I think we have a question. Okay. It's not a question, more of a comment. It was a wonderful presentation, especially your findings. This one.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Let me see if we have another. Okay, we have another one. Okay. Another question that we have, how was acculturation measured?
Okay, is that the whole question?
Yes.
Okay, that's a great question. You know, and I didn't spend really any time talking about acculturation, in part because that didn't tend to come out in the analysis. We use the ARSMA, or the acculturation rating scale for Mexican Americans, version 2, which is commonly used. We actually have another paper on that, and if you email me, I'll give you the citation for it, in which we conducted a confirmatory factor analysis on that measure. Because believe it or not, a lot of people use that measure, but it really hasn't been psychometrically analyzed very well. And what we talk about is what it looks like in our population. So what the ARSMA does is it breaks it down into two subcategories, which is the Mexican-oriented scale and the Anglo-oriented scale. You know, there's some pros and cons about the measure that I can go over, but the question, just to answer it, that's the measure we use, and I can give you more information, and we actually have a paper on that if you're interested.
Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned in the introduction was that we're gonna post the questions and answers along with the recording of the webinar and the presentation. So if you wanna, maybe you can include that reference for our participants.
Oh, yes.
Okay?
Absolutely, yes. Well.
Perfect. So we have another question. Do you find there are teens with high familialism, but were the families participating in substance use?
Yes. So if I'm understanding it correctly, did the families have their own substance use issues.
Yes.
Yes, we did. You know, that's one of the things in this study we didn't measure. Some studies do. They measure the actual level of use of the family participants beyond just the identified client. In this case, it was the adolescent. We knew that was the case anecdotally. Unfortunately, we didn't measure it in this study. But, you know, by and large, and then sometimes those could be some of the tougher families to work with, and they just need more higher level of care, more services. But by and large, what we found, what was more important in terms of engagement for us was doing some of the things around the social validity, which I talked about, was really trying to engage the parents and the adolescents. So even if they were, quote, a higher risk family, we can still engage them in order to refer them to other services or other things that may be helpful.
Okay. So maybe this question is related to that one. What factor do you feel is most significant for treatment compliance among parents and families?
Yeah, that is a great one. You know, anecdotally, I would say just having a staff, you know, and I choose my staff really carefully on all the grants I work with, all the grants I have, and my students and the folks who work with me know this. And because your staff is so critical, having a staff who can connect with your population you want to work with. You know, and connect means speaking the appropriate language, but really being able to try to understand where your participants, where your clients are coming from. It doesn't mean that they have to be, in my experience anyway, it doesn't mean they have to be of the same racial ethnic group. What it means is they need to be open, and they need to have open perspectives about learning, and really learning from the clients and the folks we work with, but really being someone who also just comes across as caring. You know, not just in it because that's their job and that's what they're supposed to do, but really has a caring capacity, you know, empathy, whatever you want to call it, to connect with the clients or the participants. That's what I found by and large. That was the most important thing. I don't have any empirical data on that. That was our anecdotal piece, but I can't say enough about that.
Okay, thank you. And you just mentioned language, and we have a question related to that. If when translation was involved, how was fidelity of communication maintained? Did you find that meaning was lost or missed?
Not necessarily. So we translated. So some of the measures. So if we just talk about the measures for 1 sec, some of the measures were already translated. Some we translated and back translated with our team. And as you know, language will vary. Spanish language will vary depending on the geographic region and so forth. So majority of our parents, our families were of Mexican descent just because of where we are in the West. Sometimes, you know, of course, you would always have opportunities when meanings will get altered and so on. But that's one of the great things about really making connections with your the folks you work with, and also your research team. So those are opportunities, you know, and it may be your staff, your treatment staff. Those are opportunities in which to bounce things off of other people you work with to make sure that we were understanding the meaning and that things didn't get lost. You know, we try to minimize that as much as we could. And I guess, you know, in kind of a nutshell, those are the things we try to do. Of course, that's always going to be a challenging issue, but I think the major thing is to learn how to problem solve when it comes up.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Another one. Do these findings suggest that the selection of the intervention model we need to identify the cultural characteristics of the client as a first step? And do you have any thoughts on what that process might look like?
Yeah, you know what? So the 2015 paper, I talk about that in the discussion section, and yes, I do think what I suggest is I think some of our assessments, because you know in substance abuse treatment we do pretty heavy-duty assessments, right? Typically, and what would, you know, why not throw in some assessments which could be brief paper and pencil measures or computer measures depending on how you obtain those data. There could be things around cultural identity or acculturation, because those things may really give you some good information that would be easy to score and easy to do. And that could help you inform the types of interventions that may be best for your clients. Now, I actually think that would be the easier part. I think the harder part it's finding interventions that are going to be more congruent with some of the cultural characteristics of the clients you work with. Because that was a large part of what this study was about, was developing that intervention. What I find in my, work out in the community and so forth is a lot of treatment centers just don't have those types of adaptive interventions available yet. So anyway.
Yes, perfect. Okay, we have a couple questions regarding characteristics of the sample. What was the, sorry, do you have any, were these two-parent households, and what was the social setting in regards to urban or rural?
Yeah, great question. I would say, I don't have a stat off the top of my head. I can't remember, so I don't want to misquote anything. I would say in terms of two-parent households is probably about 50-50, half were, half weren't. In terms of, but really what happened is probably the majority of the parents who participated were probably moms, which is not that different from a lot of other studies. And in terms of urban and rural, majority of these folks that we worked with, the majority of these families were from more of an urban setting. And actually what we did, I talked about the location where we provide the intervention, and we did later, we knew from our referrals we had addresses, so we could use the zip codes, and we could tell which areas of the valley the kids were coming from the most. And that's one of the ways that we chose our location, was to match that. So really to decrease the distance between the intervention and our potential participants.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. In terms of sample, another question is, what was the number of participants per group?
Oh, the number of participants in group would range. That's one of the challenges of doing group-based stuff, because unlike individual-based or maybe even family-based, you kind of have to wait until you have enough people in your group to do a group. We actually, what really helped was the focus group, the year of focus groups we did, because that really helped us with recruitment by the time we got to the actual intervention studies, because people knew about us in the community. We wouldn't just get referrals from the probation officers, we would also get them from families, because families had heard about us and known about us. And actually, I thought that was some of our best referrals from other families. But that's not really the question. But the question was, how many kids in the group? I would say anywhere our groups were from 6 to 10 kids. We usually had 2 groups going at the same time or concurrently, not on the same days, but during the same kind of study session. So we had a standard group going and then a accommodated group going. But usually about 6 to 8. The problem is, and I used to teach the group counseling course in our doctoral program, but the issue is if it gets too small, it's not really group therapy anymore, and if it gets too large, it just becomes unmanageable. Because we had 1 therapist per group. We didn't do co-facilitation.
Okay. So now I don't think we have enough time for more questions, but I want to remind the participants that we will have the answers to your questions along with the recording and the PowerPoint slides. Okay. So I want to thank again Dr. Jason Burrows Sanchez for the presentation. I think it was really helpful for our participants. And a reminder that an electronic copy of today's PowerPoint and audio will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic Latino. Also, we have handouts from your presentation. So your feedback is very important to us. This concludes today's webinar. And again, thank you, Dr. Burrows Sanchez. Please look at our, thank you, I really appreciate it. Please, for our participants, please look at our website to learn about future webinars. And as you leave today's webinar, you'll be directed to complete a brief survey about your experience, including the post-evaluation. So please take some time to do that, and we look forward to our future webinars. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.